Hello. Hi, everybody. Here to talk to you today about crafting conversation, design in the age of AI. First, an apology that I won't be delivering this in Italian. I don't speak it. I wish I did. My name is Daniel Padgett, and I've been working in the speech recognition and natural language understanding space for about 20 years. Everybody in design has a journey. Mine started here. I actually stared at things like this all day. This is called a spectrogram, and it represents spoken speech. This actually says 19th century. I looked for something that said buongiorno, but I couldn't find it. But I used to stare at these things and listen to audio and write down what people said, and I would mark up things that we heard in the speech signal because we were basically teaching machines how people spoke. And this is how I got started at Sony Labs about 20 years ago. And from there, I went in and I started doing a lot of design for big brands, using speech technologies across a range of devices and services, doing some interactive for entertainment and for retail, travel, and finance. And I did a lot of that all around the world, and it was a really great experience. But about 2.5 years ago, Google gave me a shout and asked if I wanted to come work for them. And I gladly accepted, because actually an opportunity like Google doesn't come around a lot. And it was actually something that people like myself in the speech recognition and natural language understanding industry, we had basically assumed that an opportunity like this with the big tech companies would arrive. We just didn't know when. It was just a matter of when the technology would be ready to do the types of things that we're doing now. I am headquartered in Mountain View. There are offices, obviously, all over the world. I've just recently been to visit the office in New York, which is fantastic, and had the pleasure of meeting my colleagues at the office here in Milan. And I also wanted to just say thank you to all of them. They've been so gracious and very helpful since I arrived yesterday morning. I do lead a team that we call Conversation Design, and we are a group of anthropologists, linguists, musicians, creative writers, computer scientists, people that have come from the entertainment industry. We are primarily focused on creating a new design discipline, a new design language. We believe very strongly that the technologies that are here are requiring us to think about how people interact with computers, machines, in a very different way. And so we're really thinking through that. And so we do a whole lot of things to support Google in these efforts, part of which is product design, which we'll get to in a minute. Another piece is just kind of figuring out, basically researching human behaviors and their interactions with computers and how we can leverage that in the experiences we want to create. But we're also doing outreach and advocacy and training, and we're working a lot with agencies and talking about how they can leverage these technologies to engage with consumers. Our primary focus is on the design of Google Assistant. I think there's a lot of talk about that, particularly in the States, but it's rapidly growing into new markets. And so we spend a lot of our time designing the core experience that is Google Assistant, everything from how you interact with it to get at streaming media like audio, video. We do productivity, things like reminders and calendars and interacting with other people in your family, like through communications, text messaging, phone calls. So we're basically designing the core experience that is Assistant. And we do that across a wide range of devices. Google, about 3 years ago, really made an investment in hardware. And so we're now producing our own phones, and we're producing our own speakers and tablets, headsets, and also even little cameras that people are using And even very recently, we started branching out and we released what we call Smart Display. This was launched last year at CES in 2018. It actually won a Best of award at CES. We were given the prize for Best Design, and we were really proud of that because this is a brand new category that we worked on very diligently for about a year, which is really quick, actually. Putting this together in just a year was really something else. And this device is won by our partner Lenovo. And so Assistant now, aside from just being a voice-only product, is now moving into an area where it also can involve screens. Anyway, all that was for introduction. What I really want to talk about is what we're seeing with respect to an absolute shift in the way that people interact and engage with computers, with machines, and ultimately with brands. And it used to be, and still is somewhat the case, that humans needed to learn how to speak the language of machines or how to use machines, right? We had to kind of, in a sense, learn their language and learn how to do it their way. But there's been this shift. And now we're launching into this time when, excuse me, when we are teaching machines to communicate, to interact like humans. This has been really evident with respect to voice technologies over the last 5 years. This is from Mary Meeker's report on the internet that she puts out every year, or internet technologies, I should say. And these are really staggering results. Baidu, the Chinese company, was saying in 2014 that 10% of their queries were coming through voice. Apple, who doesn't usually produce information like this, was telling us that Siri handles more than 1 billion queries per week through voice. Amazon kind of blew everything up by proving that they could put a device in everybody's home, and people would put it in their kitchens and in their bedrooms, and their Echo speaker was the fastest selling speaker in the market. And in 2016, Microsoft was saying that 25% of the searches that were done on Windows 10 were being done through voice, and our CEO famously reported that 20% of searches on mobile on Google on Android were done through voice, and that's a massive number, right? So this shift is happening, and people are interested in these technologies. Some more stats. I know these are kind of US-centric, but we see these trends elsewhere in the world. So 35.6 million Americans using a voice-activated assistant. This would have been in 2017. They were talking about the next year. 1/5 of the population, smartphone users using one of the assistants on their phone. And then I think this last stat is really interesting. The market of those between the ages of 25 and 34, they represent a solid quarter of all virtual assistant users. And a lot of them will be using virtual assistants in the coming years. And a question that we need to ask ourselves is why? Why is this happening? Well, I think it's quite simple. I think it's because these technologies are fast. It's easier to do something with these technologies than it is with traditional methods. It's very simple in the sense that it's not something that you have to teach. They already know how to do it. They already know how to speak. They already know how to converse. They already know how to point at something or to look at something, or all the other technologies that we support kind of support the senses that humans have and the natural behaviors that they already have. So they already know how to do it. And finally, it's ubiquitous. It's something that is easy to put everywhere, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's tackle this concept of fast and simple. This is the new Smart Display, and this is actually the Google hardware that we just released this October. This is launched only in the US, but I'm sure it will be launched in other markets in the coming months and years. But think about the information that's provided here. This is proactive information that's just available to me when I walk in the kitchen and it senses that I'm there, or if I speak to it and it recognizes my voice. It instantly and proactively provides information that's useful to me for that context. In this specific example, it's showing me in the morning when I walk into my kitchen that it's 65 degrees. That kind of indicates to me how I might want to get dressed for the day, although the weather where I live doesn't change all that much, so it doesn't really matter. And then on the right, you have just some simple commute information that is basically letting me know whether or not I need to leave early or if I have some time to leave later. But this information is just there. It's just available, and this stuff can also be made available to other devices on our ecosystem, and the technologies there are just being very assistive in the information that they're producing for users. This is an exploration by the AR team, looking at how they can use vision technologies to enhance and create a shopping experience. So you just pull out your phone and you point it at something, and it recognizes certain items and does what we call gleaming over the items that it knows, and then can, in a search card or some box, can basically tell the user what these things are. It can direct them to where they can purchase them, and really move things forward. It's a very engaging experience. This is something that the AR team has been playing with for a while. And finally, the one that we all know is just these little speakers that people are putting in their homes, and these voice interfaces that we have to get at information very quickly. It's just something that is so simple and so easy. And I actually have this kind of thought experiment. I'm assuming that everybody in this audience has a smartphone. And so I play this game, and it's just kind of, like I said, a thought experiment. But if you were to take out your phone, and I was to ask you, how many taps would it take? How many times would you have to press a button to do this task? What's 15 times 24? Basically, that means you have to unlock your phone, you have to find the calculator, which is probably a couple taps. Then you need to, type in 15 times 24. I think when I put this little exercise together, it was something like 36 taps, all right? We used to think that was the coolest thing, that, we could never get faster than mobile, right? But now you can literally turn to something and say, okay, Google, what's 15 times 24? And in an instant, you have a question. Now think about the media space, which is a massive opportunity for people who are using these smart speakers. Play the latest album by Gorillaz on Spotify. Again, you would have to open your phone, launch the app. You would have to find it in your library if you had it in your library, or you'd have to conduct a search. And you'd also have to have some knowledge about what the latest is. This technology is able to make some mappings and do some shortcuts for you, and do some of the heavy lifting for our users and consumers. And finally, think how difficult this would be. You're doing some comparisons. Any direct flights to Denver next Sunday? So it has to have knowledge about who you are, where you live. These are all things that would probably take a user or a consumer multiple apps, multiple steps, even multiple tries to find the right thing. So again, these technologies are just enabling people to get at information much more quickly and to accomplish tasks much faster. And finally, I was telling you that aside from just being fast and simple, these things are also ubiquitous, meaning there's potential for them to be everywhere, to be truly ambient and kind of in the background. Just by way of understanding Google's ecosystem, we're currently on 500 million plus devices worldwide. That includes Android and iOS systems. It includes computers. We're in the car. We're on smart speakers, as we've talked about, headphones, watches, and tablets. And we've also already partnered with roughly 1,500 Internet of Things partners, putting our technology and our chips into hardware. They have basically produced 5,000 compatible smart devices like light bulbs, and people are looking at things with respect to refrigerators and dishwashers and a whole bunch of categories. And we also support 18 languages currently, And we're going to be up to 30 languages, at least that's the promise, by the end of 2018. I mean, you throw into that, you know, that's Google's ecosystem. You throw into that the competitors that we have, like Apple and Amazon, and you can see that again, that there is this clear shift and people are moving in this direction and wanting these types of technologies. The other thing that I want to throw in here, actually, is about the fact that not only are these things fast, simple, and ubiquitous, but they're also extremely accessible, meaning this is technology that levels the playing field. In a lot of senses, or in a lot of ways, some of the technologies, information, and services we provide have been the domain of people who have access to things like smartphones and have access to things like computers. And not everybody has that same access. Not everybody can afford those devices. Not everybody wants those devices. And in some instances, people can't even use those devices because of certain limitations they might have. For instance, this is a little cardboard kit. It costs $15 US that our SDK team put out in 2017. It is quite literally a speaker, a microphone, and a microchip, and you fold the box, and you put this together, and you have a Google Home. $15. Something that's quite affordable, but you have now access to all of the world's information through Google, all of the searches that you want, and all of that information through a very simple technology like this one. I also wanted to kind of raise to you, when I was talking about the fact that people don't necessarily have access to the type of devices that we have, we're seeing massive growth in India. We've partnered with some companies there, and we've found ways to launch Google Assistant on a feature phone. Last December, it's called the Reliance Geo phones. And the usage of Assistant has grown 6 times over the past 4 weeks, or at that time, the past 4 weeks since they launched it. And the reason is that they are they have this mobile-only mindset. There is nothing but mobile. And they don't think of the internet as something outside of mobile. Their mobile device is like their television, their wallet, it's their classroom. It's all of the things to them, right? And so on this one device, we've put this technology, and there's just this massive uptake because now they have access that they didn't have before. They just couldn't get at this stuff with the devices that they had and the services that they had. Finally, I'm not going to play this video, but I just wanted to raise it for you, and if you take down the name, it's a great thing to watch. We did a video recently with a young man. His name is Robbie, and the video is called Robbie's Voice Activated Room. Robbie has been in a wheelchair for all his life, and he's depended on his parents for doing a lot of the things that you and I take for granted. Turning on lights, turning on TVs, getting ready for bed, shopping, those sorts of things. And when Google came out with these technologies, his dad, being quite savvy, hooked up his son's room with with a Google Home device, but also with some tinkering, started automating some things for his son's room, and creating routines that did some of these things for his son. And so now his son is completely, well, not completely, but largely independent of the help that he used to have to get from his parents. He can do a whole bunch of tasks that they used to have to do for him. And now they've even transferred what they did in his room to a college dorm room where he is now attending university because this technology has freed him up to do so. And it's a really, really great story, and I encourage you to check that out. So it's clear that we have this opportunity. It's clear that people are adopting these technologies. It's clear that there is this shift toward natural computing. And so we have to, I think, start thinking about how we design these services, how we present these to the world in a very different way. We have an entirely different system here and an entirely different interaction model with users, and it's very exciting, but it also means that we have to kind of come up with some new ways to do design and do engagement. Now, as designers love metaphors, right? We use them all the time. In fact, you're reading this on a page, quote unquote, in a window, or would be on a screen. Those are metaphors that we use so that people have some sort of understanding in computing when they're using their laptop, right? Well, my team and at Google, when we're thinking about these technologies that I'm discussing, things like voice and vision and touch and tap and typing and natural language understanding and image processing, we like to think of and leverage the metaphor of conversation. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about why that is. This is kind of an academic definition of conversation, so I'll just read it. Conversation is a joint activity in which two or more participants use linguistic forms and nonverbal signals to communicate interactively. If you break this down into its individual parts, conversation, then, so defined, gives us all the things we need to create an interaction between a user and a machine in a new ecosystem with new capabilities. And so I'm going to walk you through that now. The first thing I want to talk to you about is the fact that conversation is a joint activity between two or more participants. So let's think about that for a second. What we really are talking about here is that we have on one side the user or the consumer and a bot. With respect to the user has 150,000 years of language evolution behind them, right? They also have an entire lifetime of knowledge and context that they have built up from birth through to whatever age they are now. It's the thing that allows people to have interactions like this one. And so in this example, my friend Margaret is walking into a room, let's say, and saying, I need a drink. And my friend Laura responds, I hear the Eagles good. Now, why is this interesting? Let's think for a second. This is just 9 words. This is a conversation in 9 words. They've had a conversation, 9 words only. I keep saying 9 words, but that's important. How much information is packed into these 9 words? Margaret came in and said, I need a drink. What kind of drink is it? With the sigh, it's probably an alcoholic drink, right? She needs a stiff drink because she's had a rough day. On the other, Laura understands that this is an alcoholic drink, and she says, I hear the Eagles good. So we know that Laura has understood that it's an alcoholic drink, which means that the Eagle is probably a bar or a restaurant that serves alcohol. She's also giving some information on top of that says this is probably a good place for you to go right now, which means it's probably open. And she's also indicating that she's never been there before because she's saying, I hear that the Eagle is good. It's indicating that Laura's never been there, that it's a good place to get a drink, and that Margaret could go there pretty much immediately. So in 9 words, we've communicated something like 20 different concepts. And this is the power of language. This is the power of human-to-human communication, and it's largely what we're trying to do when we start leveraging these technologies. Those capabilities that users have, it makes them instant experts. It also means that they have very high expectations about how these things should work, and they have a very, very, very low tolerance for error. Bots, on the other hand, can only be as smart as the data we give it. Luckily, Google's in a position where we have 20 years of search behind us. That's great. That's a really good start. But it still only has the data that we give it. It only has the behaviors that we define, and it can only manifest the personas that we create, the characters that we create. And this is a really interesting opportunity for people looking at this space. Because when people hear any voice, this was a study done by 2 Stanford psychologists and linguists, Clifford Nass and Scott Brave. When people hear any voice, they automatically and subconsciously assign a personality to it. You do it in under a second. As soon as you pick up a phone and talk to someone, say in customer service, or the instant that you speak to someone you've never met in a cafe or a restaurant, you start making assumptions about who that person is with respect to their social status, their economic status, who they are, where they've been. You can't help it. It is hardwired into you, and you do it whether you think you do or not. That means that when we're creating these experiences, the experience literally is the brand, and it's not something that you can leave to chance. The bot has to reflect your company. It has to manifest the brand attributes. And in that sense, it needs to have some sort of backstory. It has to have a role. Because if you don't do that, then your users will define it for you. It's not something that you can leave to chance. It's something that you have to take as seriously as any other digital media that you're producing, from colors to typography. This is something that has to be taken very seriously. So a few tips on how to get there. One is, I think, a given, understanding the brand, who the customers are, and the tasks that they have at hand. The second is literally defining a character and writing a biography. And that's not a biography that you're necessarily going to share with the world, but it's going to be a biography that your teams can use to help center them around who this character is and the types of things it would say, the ways it would interact with the user. It's also something that you can bring to life through recording like monologues and dialogues that you create, and we'll see one in a second. And it's also something that you can test with users to make sure that it fits with the brand. We run studies where we will have users interact with a bot that we've created, and then we ask them to rank its efficacy across brand attributes. And we get a real sense for whether or not we have produced something that has provided the right brand fit. Now, I want to just give you run through a quick example of like how we might go about doing this. This is an abbreviated version, but let's imagine two airlines. Airlines do roughly the same thing. So on one hand, we have a company called Important Airlines. We're important, and we will get you there. That's their tagline. And Millennial Airlines, it's an awesome day to fly, right? So two airlines, two brands. And let's dig in a little bit. Important Airlines, their tagline again, we're important and we will get you there. Their brand attributes are, they're just very solid, they're very reliable, they're confident, they're straightforward. And they're experts in this space, and they will definitely keep you safe. They're all about safety. Their customers are mid-30s and up, probably business travelers, high value, and frequent flyers. On the other hand, we have Millennial, who's saying, it's an awesome day to fly. And they're bold, friendly, hip, exciting, fun, and delightful. Their consumers are people who are in their late teens or in their up to their mid-30s. They're holiday makers looking to go on adventures. They're also young families. They're very budget conscious. And they're not necessarily traveling all that often. Again, this is just kind of an adventure for them. Now, let's look at kind of like the same exact interaction, but between these two brands. So this is what we call a sample dialogue, a scripted conversation between a bot and a user for Important Airlines. And now let's listen. We didn't get it. Oh, no audio. Anyway, if I go back, I'll point out the differences, and I'll talk you through this. So on this one, on Important Airlines, actually, if we could have heard the audio, you would have heard actually a male voice, a British male voice, who was very formal in his register, right? Good morning, you're through to Important. Am I speaking with Wally? That's right. And then, thank you. And do you require information regarding your flight to London today? Right? It's leaning toward the formal side, and the voice that we selected, again, was one that sounded more formal to most consumers. On the flip side, with Millennial Airlines, right, we get kind of a bit more of a lighter interaction. And so they're supporting their tagline. When Millennial introduces itself, you might even hear, some sort of audio treatment, like some music or something like that. And they're saying, it's an awesome day to fly. And is this Wally? Yep. Great. Do you want info? Info instead of information about your flight to London today. So it's these subtle things. They're the same exact interaction, but they're changed slightly, actually changed a great deal through the words that we use and the voices that we use to present our character. Moving on. We talk about conversation. It also has forms and signals to do interactive things with consumers. And what this says to us is that there's actually structure, that there's actually something that we can leverage to think about how our users need to interact with computers, and something that we can kind of build on top of. The first thing that we want to think about is the fact that people tend to operate when they are talking human to human on something we call the cooperative principle. This was proposed by a theoretical linguistic philosopher named Paul Grice in the 70s. But basically he posits that when people are speaking human to human, they are always, or they tend to tell the truth. They tend to provide the right amount of information, meaning they're giving exactly the amount of information that's required to move the conversation forward. They're providing relevant information, meaning it's on topic. And they're also speaking in a manner that makes it easy for the other listener to comprehend. Another thing that we do in human-human conversation is turn-taking. And we indicate, basically, we take the floor and we start talking, and then we indicate when we want the other person to respond. And we do that through a number of different ways. A lot of people just think it's because we've stopped talking, but we actually do it by changing our pitch and the melody of the speech that we use, our intonation, and whether or not we're speaking loudly or even more quickly, if we speed up, if we pause, if we start. These are all cues that we use to let people know it's time for them to talk, or I still have the floor and I want to keep talking. A colleague of mine actually proved that you didn't need words to do this. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this little device on here. It's called a kazoo, and people, talk through it, and it just sounds like weird noises. He basically put two people in a room and had them have a conversation through kazoos, so there were no words. All they could use was the rhythm and melody of speech, and they were able to have a pretty solid conversation, right? It's like all of those cues are so ingrained that you know when it's your turn, and he proved that in an exercise in front of a room. It was quite amazing. And the last thing that we do is we leverage this thing called cohesion. Basically, it's the thread of the conversation that kind of ties everything together. On the left side, you have an interface that lacks that cohesion, that doesn't use the devices that humans do, and it's a very stilted conversation, and it repeats information over and over and over. What you see on the right side is more akin to what humans would do in a human-to-human conversation, and basically supplying information to let the person that they're interacting with know where we stand, know what's coming next. It also removes information that's old information. So you see some of the corrections on the right there that show how we do cohesion in dialogue in a human-to-human fashion. And these are, again, all things that we are trying to leverage and trying to use as we design these things and as we design these systems and experiences to keep people comfortable and to make it easier for them to use these systems. Lastly, or not lastly, another thing is the fact that when we speak, we also use linguistic and non-linguistic signals or nonverbal signals. Basically, this gets at the point that we have conversations on all types of mediums in a bunch of different ways. We talk on the phone, and that's voice only, right? We talk in person, and we start using our hands and facial expressions, right? We talk on chat or SMS. That's also a conversation. We might chat at work, where we have the ability to point at things and to kind of share some information by putting it up on a board, and or even like what we're doing here. This is a one-way conversation, but you're seeing all of the things that I'm presenting to you while I'm speaking about them. I mean, just think about last time you were in a cafe. And also, I want to thank my new Italian friends for telling me about coffee etiquette. Americans don't have the same coffee etiquette I've learned as Italians do. For instance, I was told that you don't drink a cappuccino anytime except the morning. And I ordered one when I got here at 3:30 in the afternoon, and I wondered why the gentleman looked at me weird. But now I know. Thank you very much for teaching me about that. Anyway, let's think about the last time you were in a cafe and you're able to point at the pastries and describe the one you want. You're able to point at the one you want. You can say, you can even ask, what's that one down at the bottom? You can point, you can select. You can use that information to your advantage to move the conversation along. You can also compare items on a menu. And yeah, I know our coffee is way more expensive than yours, and you probably wouldn't even call a lot of this coffee. But anyway, sorry about that. But these are things that you can use to push the conversation forward. You can tell the person, hey, I want that one, or tell me more about that thing. In the same, if you took all of that away, if you took all of those signals away, and all you had was speech, it would be like a ticker tape, and it's just moving past you really quick. And you would have to ask the person, what do you have? And they would say, espresso, Americano, so on and so forth. And the conversation would be much more difficult. So, to that end, at Google, as we start pushing across more and more surfaces, we start to think about design across a multimodal spectrum. On one side, we have this kind of voice-only speaker area. On the far side, we have visual-only type devices, maybe like a TV. We have our speakers here. We have things like watches and TVs on that side. The new voice-forward interface on the smart display where we have Assistant embedded in these screens. And then we have mobile right in the middle. And the interesting thing about mobile is that it can be all of the things. If I took out if this was my mobile phone and this was the screen, if I'm here, it's one interaction. If I turn it over and the screen is off, it's now a voice-only interaction. If I dock it in a car port, it becomes more of a voice-forward interaction. So it can be all of the modes all at once. And so we have the complication of the user interface changing over this spectrum. Because we're Google and we need to scale across a bunch of devices, across an ecosystem, we've kind of created this way of responding across this ecosystem, some of which leverages a spoken prompt, display prompts, cards, and suggestion chips. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of rapidly go through this. But basically, the point is that with this componentized thing, you can basically build once and push across your ecosystem with these components. So you see how they manifest themselves across the spectrum. On the voice-only side, obviously, we only have voice interaction, so it's voice in, voice out. On the voice-forward, we lead with the voice, but kind of point to the visual. On intermodal, the mobile, it can be both of those things equally, and on the visual end, it becomes very much a visual interface and likely a touch interface. And the last thing I want to touch on in the last 2 or 3 minutes is the fact that this allows us to communicate interactively through a number of ways. One, obviously, is we can speak, we can type, we can tap, and we can show. And eventually, I think we're going to start seeing things with respect to gaze and being able to see what the machine sees, or the machine being able to see what we see. That will be something that comes in the near future. So we have all of these inputs and outputs. We have all of these ways to communicate with machines. And the really interesting thing is that these technologies, they used to be what we call deterministic, meaning if you tapped the thing, you knew what it was going to do. The input just had this repeatable output. What we're dealing with now is technologies that are more probabilistic, meaning that there's a lot more ambiguity, right? Especially with something like speech, especially with something like vision. The computer has to almost be making a guess about what the input is. and making its best guess. And so that means that when we design these things, we have to really take that into account and manage it. We do this quickly in the voice world. We do this process in an instant. We hear words, we assess the speech sounds, meaning we basically put it into sentences. We process it against our knowledge of the world, and we derive and interpret meaning through what we know. And we literally do that in under half a second. So going back to our example, I need a drink and I hear the Eagles good. What if Margaret said, I need a drink, and Laura said, Dr. Frank is amazing? It's a very weird response, right? Well, what she heard was, I need a shrink, right? In the US, a shrink is a psychologist. So it's a very weird response to I need a drink, but it's something that happens every day. We mishear things, we misunderstand things, and we give an awkward response. The great thing is that humans have a really easy way to repair these things and get people back on track. Computers, not so much. So they have to do this in about the same amount of times that humans do it, and we're not quite there yet. They need to do that, but if something goes wrong at any level here, then we're going to get the weird response like we had on the previous slide. So when we're designing for these things, we have to think about that. We have to think about the fact that the speech signal is something, when we're talking, it is linear. It doesn't present a whole lot of information like you might be able to on a page. It is going one direction, outward, and it's ephemeral, meaning it's faded. As soon as I've said it, it's gone. It's committed to your short-term memory, but that's about it. It's not there. It's not permanent like we have on a screen. And so that presents challenges that we have to manage. How do we distinguish when someone is speaking versus not speaking? How do we know when they've started talking or when they've stopped talking? How do we help people get back on track? Well, we use, just like humans would, we use contextually sensitive error prompting and repair strategies. Now, this is pulled directly off, I'll give you the site for this, but we've developed a framework that helps people creating these experiences to create things leveraging our best practices. And on the left, we have what we call an escalating error handling strategy that would do pretty much what a human would do. If we ask somebody what size pizza they want and they say grande and that's not a size we support, we might just quickly say like a human would, sorry, what size? And so they can try again. If they fail again, then we can give them more information to try to get them back on track. The last thing I want to point out is that recognition and understanding are two different things, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. What users say is different from what users mean. And at Google, we've had a lot of progress on really parsing what people say. Since July 2016, we have made great strides in what we call our word error rate. That means when people speak to a machine, we are basically hearing them correctly 95% of the time, and that is an amazing technological feat. But the problem is actually understanding the words that they say, not just printing out what they said, but understanding what they mean. In the United States, there are roughly 50 cities called Springfield. There's one in every state. So when someone says, what's the weather in Springfield, we can't automatically assume a single Springfield, and we need to ask that. Here's an example that I localized. Hopefully this lands with you folks. But what if somebody said, play volare, right? Now, I looked this up as recently as yesterday, and it's a song, it's a movie, it's a playlist, it's an audiobook. Let's assume they tell us that it's the song. By whom? Do we want what I think people consider the original by, I will probably butcher the name if I tried to say it. Which artist is it by? Is it by Domenico Modugno? Is that how you say it? Sorry. Is it by Dean Martin? Is it the one by David Bowie? How many people knew David Bowie covered Volare? Oh, wow. It's cool, so go listen to it. How many people knew Barry White covered Volare? Do people know who Barry White is? Anyway, Soul Singer. He covered Velar, also a very cool version, and I would suggest that you check it out. The fact is, the point here is that we can't always know, right? And so what we need to do is manage that in these interfaces. We need to help people along. We need to provide them with information that lets them know that we did understand, or ask them when we don't understand. And again, here's an example taken from our site where we talk about how to manage that, and I won't go into the details. So, to conclude, we've seen this massive shift in the way people are engaging with machines. We're seeing a massive shift in moving away from having to learn how to interact with computers learning to how to interact with us. And in that shift, there's going to be a lot for us to manage. We have to manage the users and their expectations of these technologies because they know how to do it already. They just do it instinctively. And so we have to manage that expectation. We have to take care to create branded personas that reflect the attributes that we want it to reflect and to really get our story and our brand across. We have to think about an ecosystem that takes us beyond mobile, that takes us into an arena where there are a whole lot of devices and that there can be continuity between all these things. We have to think about these modalities, and we have to think about this fuzziness. As I've said, when we're thinking about how to manage all of that and to create these experiences across an ecosystem, we think conversation is the right metaphor for doing so. We hope you do too. And if you need help in creating all of these things, you can start here at actions.google.com/design. We've outlined a complete framework on what conversation is and how to build these experiences across our ecosystem. Also, some additional resources if you want to read about the gentleman who did the studies on people's interactions with machines, Nass and Yen. A colleague of mine, John Gola, wrote Voice User Interface Design about 15 years ago, and another colleague of mine, Kathy Pearl, wrote Designing Voice User Interfaces on O'Reilly. These are all very helpful resources. And with that, I will say goodbye, and thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate your time.